Hi all, welcome back to another podcast. Today I'm joined with Kanishka and Viven, and we're going to be talking about influenzas, more commonly known as the flu.
Right, so I think it's important to define or at least explain what exactly influenza is. So there's quite a lot of detail to go into, but I'll try and keep it somewhat short. It's often referred to as the flu, and it differs from the common cold in that they're caused by different viruses. But nonetheless, influenza, like the common cold, is a respiratory illness, and it's highly contagious and affects predominantly the nose and throat, but can also affect the lungs. Um, Influenza spreads when people with the flu cough, sneeze, or talk, which sends droplets with the virus into the air and potentially into the mouths or noses of people who are nearby, similarly to COVID-19, which was mentioned in another podcast. And it's caused by the influenza virus, of course. So there are four types of the influenza virus. There's A, B, C, and D. Human influenza, A and B viruses cause seasonal epidemics of the disease, with influenza A being the primary cause. And influenza A is divided into types of different types based on the nature of two proteins on the surface of the virus. Those two proteins are hemagglutinin, of which there are 18 types and variations, and neuraminidase, of which there are 11 types and variations. And that's why we have a combination of names such as H1N1 with the standing for with the letter standing for the respective proteins, and yeah, so H1N1, for example, being the form that caused the pandemic that occurred in 1918 and a resurgence in 2009. And then we can equally combine combinations of these together with different variants of each protein, affecting the virus's contagiousness and potency. But does anyone have statistics or anything like that? Because I feel as though it really helped to picture the scale at which influenza affects us.
Yeah, so the seasonal flu, the one that peaks in the winter, kills between 291,000 and 646,000 people worldwide every year.
Hmm.
And that's a new estimate that's higher than the previous one of 250,000 to 500,000 deaths a year. Public Health England estimated that on average, 17,000 people have died from the flu in England between 2014 and 2015 and 2018 and 2019, with the
Wow.
yearly deaths varying widely from a high of 28,000 in 2014/2015 to the 1,600 in 2018/2019.
Hmm.
In June, Public Health England published updated figures which showed a total of 3,900 flu deaths in 2018 and 2019. The new figures, which include changes in other years, put the average at around 15,000 deaths each flu season in this period. So a significant decrease. Public Health England don't release mortality rates, but in the US, the records are showing. The number of cases has ranged from 9 million to 45 million a year. So you see a great increase in terms of comparing with the UK. And the number of deaths range from 12,000 to 61,000. These figures suggest that over the past decade in the US, the percentage of flu cases that resulted in hospitalization has consistently been between around 1% and 2%. And the percentage of cases that result in death has been between 0.1% and 0.2%. These stats were all taken from March of this year as well. So influenza has a big, profound effect on most of the population. But what is the way that influenza attacks us? Like, how does it actually get into the
Yeah,
body?
so if we zoom in more scientifically, we'd find that the influenza virus causes an infection in the respiratory tract, or nose, throat, and lungs. And as Kanishka mentioned earlier, and the virus is inhaled or transmitted usually via your fingers to the mucous membrane of the mouth, nose, or eyes. And then it travels down the respiratory tract and binds to epithelial cells, and that's surface cells that are lining the lung airways via specific molecules on the cell surface. And once they're inside, the virus hijacks the protein manufacturing machinery of the cell and generates its own viral proteins to create more and more viral particles. And once mature viral particles are produced, they are released from the cell and then go on to invade adjacent cells. And this just carries on, making the infection worse and worse. Influenza is referred to as seasonal. Why is that?
Right, so influenza is referred to as seasonal because often you'll hear people talk about flu season and stuff like that in the colder months, and that's essentially because the influenza virus is actually more suited to cold conditions. It can live longer in these conditions and can thus invade our bodies and infect us far easier. The virus lives longer indoors in winter because the air is far less humid than outside. and while it's alive in the air, it's easy for people to inhale it and for it to land on the eyes, nose, or mouth. And then, as Ashish, you described, for it to act on us and infect us. And also, we are often inside more, so we're in close contact with people a lot more. And then that way it spreads between us a lot easier. So when we're spending more time indoors and we have close contact with each other, it makes it easier for it to spread. Some research has also suggested that the virus is coated in a lipid covering, which we know it is, but at warmer temperatures, this lipid covering melts away. And when that happens, it it's essentially weakened, which is why it doesn't survive for as long as at the warm temperatures of summer and stuff. Whereas in the in cooler temperatures, like in winter months, that lipid layer is in more of like a jelly structure, and that enables it to be far more durable and live longer, and thus infect for a longer period of time. So that's kind of some of the science behind it. Because that gel layer kind of primes it for survival, whereas in hotter temperatures it's stripped away. So, what's the current system in place to fight the virus? I know there's a flu jab. How does that work and everything?
Yeah, so everyone's heard of the flu jab. It's basically an annual vaccination that anyone over 6 months old should be taking, especially the people that work around children because they're around the vulnerable populations and also sick people. Like the COVID vaccine, it stimulates more antibodies to be produced. It takes about 2 weeks to generate the new antibodies. So during those 2 weeks, your body is still susceptible to the infection. The vaccines are available either as an injection or a nasal spray. I was just thinking, like, maybe the COVID vaccine will follow in that. Every year, the flu vaccine is altered to protect against the new flu strains that are circulating.
Yeah. I was just wondering, what are the benefits of the flu jab? Like, obviously, the most obvious and perhaps the greatest benefit is that the flu vaccine helps protect you and those close to you from getting the flu. But what are the others?
Yeah, exactly. That is the main benefit. But it also protects vulnerable populations in the community, like you'd expect, like infants, young children, elderly adults, and those with chronic health conditions. These especially vulnerable people risk serious complications from the infection. The vaccination also lessens the intensity of the illness if you do catch flu after you've taken the vaccine. That's why the flu vaccine helps protect against potentially serious complications of influenza. Another benefit, let's say you have certain serious illnesses, flu vaccinations may even be more important. So people with heart disease who get vaccinated are less likely to experience harmful cardiac events. And also I found that people with diabetes and chronic lung disease who are vaccinated spend less time in the hospital on average.
There are obviously also some drawbacks by taking the flu jab. So it takes around 2 weeks after receiving the vaccination for your body to develop immunity, and during this time period, you can still catch the flu. Also, you can catch the flu after the 2 weeks, and it's not guaranteed that you get 100% immunity from the vaccine from the flu. Another reason you could catch the flu is that if there wasn't a good enough vaccine match, so researchers would need to decide which strains to include in the vaccine many months before the flu season actually starts. So sometimes you won't have a good match between the selected strains and the strains that actually end up circulating during flu season. And this means the vaccine isn't as effective and develops less immunity compared to if you had the correct strains.
Okay, I acknowledge the drawbacks with the vaccine, and I understand it is only 60 to 65% effective, I think. And the biggest question that patients have is, can I get the flu from the vaccine itself? No, you can't. It's not possible to get the influenza from the flu vaccine. Injectable flu vaccines contain either inactivated viruses or no virus at all. So neither one of them is capable of making people sick. The nasal spray flu vaccine does contain live weakened viruses. It also cannot make people sick with the flu, though. The viruses used in the nasal vaccine are cold adapted, meaning they're designed to only infect cooler environments, such as the environment inside your nose. The viruses in the nasal vaccine are incapable of infecting warmer body areas like your lungs. So while some people who receive the nasal spray do develop some symptoms, those symptoms are typically milder and last a shorter time than they do in cases of flu infection.
So, what are the future prospects of influenza?
So there are a few different types of vaccine, first and foremost. So there's the egg-based vaccines, which are like the flu jab. And essentially what happens there is egg or cells of an egg are used to enable us to extract an attenuated meaning weakened and numbed down form of the virus. And they can also be used to extract an inactive or dead version of the virus. But the egg-based vaccine production process begins with us identifying fertilized hen's eggs and incubating them for several days to allow the virus to replicate after being injected with a form of influenza. And that would be the one which we wish to vaccinate against. So, for example, H1N1, for example. And then the fluid. So then the virus would be replicating. The fluid containing the virus is then harvested from the egg, and for inactivated influenza vaccines like flu shots, the vaccine viruses are then killed and the virus antigen is purified and the virus antigen will be produced by the egg, and then the manufacturing process would continue with quality testing and filling and distribution. There's also recombinant vaccines which are created synthetically, and to make a recombinant vaccine, flu scientists first obtain DNA, such as genetic instructions for making a surface protein, which I mentioned earlier, like the hemagglutinin, which are found on the influenza virus. And then the antigen of that is synthesized, harvested, and manufactured essentially. So there's also cell-based flu vaccines, which involve several steps. So first, the influenza viruses that have been grown in cells to make CVVs, which are Canada virus vaccines, have to be approved, and then they're provided to a vaccine manufacturer. The vaccine manufacturer inoculates the CVVs into a cultured mammalian cell instead of into the egg cells, and this allows the CVVs to replicate or make copies for a few days, and then the virus containing fluid is collected from the cells and the virus antigen purified, very similar to the egg-based vaccines, but instead of using egg cells, they use different cells in essence. But while these three different types of vaccines do provide different levels of immunity, as I mentioned in the bit where I started talking about what influenza is, there are many different types. So you have H1N1, H2N3, for example, and all sorts of different combinations. But because there are so many different types, we obviously can't vaccinate against all of them. So, like I think it was Ashish mentioned earlier, we need to decide scientists need to decide which one they want to vaccinate against prior to the flu season starting. And what happens is, what makes that so difficult is that certain types of influenza, certain strains aren't as well grown in chickens. So because they're egg-based vaccines, chickens don't grow H3N2, for example, as well, which makes it hard to protect against. And that's why all variants can be hard to protect against. But I don't know if Viven has further information on that. So essentially, because of all these different types of vaccines, they're trying to research is currently being done to try and find one vaccine which works against all strains. And doing that would circumvent a lot of problems. I don't know if anyone has more on the problems, but essentially that research is relatively promising. And what they hope to do is combine different types of vaccines being used currently to enable us to vaccinate against all different types of influenza instead of scientists having to predict which one they want to vaccinate against.
Reassortment results is a new subtype of virus with antigens that are a mixture of the original strains. When a shift happens, most people have little or no immunity at all against the resulting new virus. And viruses emerging as a result of antigenic shift are the ones most likely to cause big pandemics. So essentially, by the time flu season comes around, your body's immunity to it is virtually non-existent, and by getting the flu shot every year, you're protecting yourself from new strains while also boosting your continuous protection.
Yeah, Viven, that's quite interesting. Obviously, I think influenza is obviously a huge problem. I think the need for this kind of new vaccine is quite obvious in terms of helping our scientists have to stop predicting what strain of influenza is going to be prominent in the year. I think if they can overcome some of the negatives you mentioned, it could be promising. But right now, obviously, it needs a lot more work. Overall, I think it was very well put. So, yeah.
Thanks for listening to today's podcast. Please like, subscribe, and leave any questions, any comments, or any future podcast ideas in the Google Forms below in the description. Follow our Instagram, our newly made Twitter handle. And we'll see you next time. Thank you.